Hello, hello, welcome back. I'm Nick,
Hello, I'm Matt.
and this is Nick and Matt's English Corner, Everyday English Corner, episode 7. And today we're going to be
Yep.
talking about video games.
Yes, video games. One of my favorite topics.
It's a personal favorite of both of ours, and I figured this episode would be particularly interesting because there is over a 10-year gap in age between Matt and I, which means that when we were growing up, we fundamentally grew up playing completely different games on completely different generations of video game console. So,
Yes.
with that being said, Matt, I wanted to ask you what were some of the games that you played growing up?
So, my very first memory of video games is playing Super Mario on the Super Nintendo when I was about 6 years old.
Wow.
Uh, and I remember playing a bunch of that. But the first time I got my own console to play on and my own video games was the Nintendo 64. If you're ever seen any games from that.
I'm somewhat familiar, and I believe it has a different name in Japan. But yeah, that is, as of nowadays, that is an antiquated piece of hardware.
Oh, it absolutely is. You would be very difficult to actually find one. And I remember playing like Mario World, a game called Banjo Kazooie, and a few like that when I had it. Though my first introduction to playing uh, longer games was like Final Fantasy VII when I got a PlayStation 1. And I think that got me into a whole generation of Japanese games.
Yes, the original PlayStation, which, if I remember correctly, came out before the Xbox. Feel free to correct me on
Y-
that.
Yeah, I believe Xbox came out around the same time PlayStation 2 did.
Yeah, and that tracks because I remember when I was in first grade in elementary school, I would go over to my friend's house who lived right across the block, and we would play games on his Xbox, the original one. This was before the 360 even came out, and that was in itself a generation defining console. I remember games like the original Halo were personal favorites of mine. Not that I should have been playing those games when I was that young, but um, that was probably the console that I have the fondest memories of from my youth.
Oh, absolutely. I think the one I spent the most time on was definitely PlayStation 1. I didn't own my own PlayStation, but my stepfather did. And I used to play some of the more restricted games like Resident Evil
Ooh,
while they were at work when I was like 9 years old. So nobody knew I was playing those games, even though they were not appropriate for my age.
right. So I'm glad I'm not the only one, but
Yes.
I the Resident Evil games are that's definitely a different beast. But was this like the original Resident Evil, like one, two?
At that time, it was Resident Evil 2, the
Wow,
very first one I got to play.
yeah, that's a long, long time ago. I really can't think of other PlayStation 1 games because that was before my time. And you're absolutely right. It was the PlayStation 2 that was out when I was a kid. And then I remember when I turned 7, the big news was that all these new game consoles were coming out. Like around when I was around 7 or 8 years old, the Xbox 360 was announced, and that was revolutionary. And then the PlayStation 3 came out, which started the whole console war. And then the absolutely groundbreaking and my personal favorite console of the time, the Nintendo Wii, hit
Oh,
the
yes.
shelves. I'm sure you remember
That
that.
one was, yeah, very popular. And it especially was very effective because that console sold to everyone. It sold to kids and it actually sold to like, 60, 70-year-old people. So that was like a very popular console for any age range.
Yeah, I don't think it can truly be stated just how impactful that console was. The the amount of games that were accessible to different ages of people, like you said earlier, was already one thing in itself. Like, for example, Wii Sports Resort is a game that anyone could play at any time, any age, and just it was so accessible. I'm getting nostalgic thinking
Absolutely.
about it because I had so much fun playing games like Super Mario Galaxy, going over to my
Yes.
friend's house. I never owned one, but I really wanted one.
I didn't own one either. I got to play with friends. I got to play with like different age groups because I was still a kid then too, even though I was a teenager. And I played with like grandfathers. I played with people's parents. It was really a good console for just letting everyone have fun together.
Yeah, it was like the de facto go to party console. Like, if you went over to a friend's house, they would always have a Wii that everyone could play on. Whether it was their Wii or like someone would bring their Wii to the other person's house, and then you'd play games like, well, the aforementioned Wii Sports Resort or, well, Super Smash Brothers Brawl. It was always such a great time looking back on it.
Ah, yes. I think I remember playing Mario Tennis, I believe was the one.
Ah, yes.
And I spent
Classic.
a lot of time playing that with friends.
Yeah. The and I would also argue that the Nintendo Wii, or well, the impact that the Nintendo Wii had probably somewhat paved the way for Nintendo's later success with more recent consoles like the Switch, because that console really just blew everything out of the water. At least that was the impression that I had personally.
Absolutely. And I remember there was a console you may not recognize, but it was very, very popular when it came out, and then it quickly died after, was Dreamcast. Have you ever heard that one?
I can understand why you said it died out because I I cannot think for the life of me of what that is.
So it was a console created by Sega. And, obviously they were a very, very strong company at that day, on that time, because they were the creators like Sonic Adventures. They owned the Capcom games. They owned Soul Calibur. So those names you recognize, they owned all of those. So the console did really well, but they stopped supporting it, so it just died after the new consoles came out.
Oh, I see. I, I've heard about something like that. I don't think it was that console. I remember there was some console from way back in the day that Sega created. I think it was called like the Sega Saturn or something, and I heard that that like completely flopped. I'm not sure on the specifics or if you know anything about that, but I do remember some sort of story like that.
Saturn, I don't know about it specifically, but I know it was before Dreamcast.
Right. So Sega was never really the best when it came to creating their own console, but At least they're still somewhat relevant in the gaming
Oh yeah,
landscape with their games. But
their
of course,
games are still impactful.
of course, but when it comes to consoles or the companies that create the consoles, the
Mm.
big three that I always think of, and the ones that we've been talking about for this entire episode, are Microsoft with the Xbox, Nintendo with whatever new console they put out, and then Sony with the PlayStation. And those have pretty much been the dominating three, or the three most dominant companies in the console gaming market.
Yeah, they have the market basically cornered just by the three of them. However, just using a computer for gaming is getting more and more popular every year, especially since a lot of the consoles are not making exclusive games anymore. Especially games like, I think recently Final Fantasy 16 came out for the computer, so it's not dedicated to just on the console.
Yeah, and that's a really good segue. I wanted to bring up PC gaming because that is obviously the other big alternative to owning a console, and it's the main platform that the two of us have been using for quite some time now, even to this very day. I don't own any video game consoles currently, but there's so much you can do on PC. And like you said, a lot of these companies, especially Sony recently, haven't been limiting their games to their consoles as much. Or if they do, they usually release them to PC afterwards, such as the new God of War game, which is now available on Steam. So, gaming on PC is really just a multifaceted Swiss Army knife that really you can't go wrong with.
Absolutely. Because there's always a benefit and a downside. The benefit of consoles is buying a console is actually cheaper if you want to just game, because a lot of the companies sell their consoles at a loss. Like it actually costs more money to make the console than it does to actually for you to buy them. And the purpose of that is they actually do that to get the console in your hands and make money off of game sales. Whereas a computer that can play games costs more to actually build or buy, but you get a bigger variety of games you can play.
Right. And also because games are always evolving, specifically the graphics and the requirements that are needed to run the game on a computer, because they're always evolving. Um, this often means that later down the line, you're going to have to buy new parts for your computer or just get a new computer outright if you don't want to build one on your own, which also ends up costing a lot of money.
It does, especially because if you build your own computer, it's still expensive, but you can definitely save yourself, like, for example, if you were buying a $2,000 computer, you could probably build it under the same stats for maybe $1,500. But it does mean you have to do a lot of work to put it together.
But if you do get the parts for the computer that you want and you know the types of games that you want to play, it does end up being a pretty good investment for people who really get into serious PC gaming, because a good computer will go a long way for a very long time and the games
It
will run like butter.
it will. And one thing a lot of people don't realize is you don't need to spend a lot of money to just play the games. You can typically build a computer for about 700 US dollars, and it can play almost any game on the market. Now, you can't turn everything up the max, but you can still play any game.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest advantage of PC gaming as compared to consoles because with console gaming, the console that you buy is the console that you get. And you can't take out any of the hardware or make it specialized because that's the way the company made it, that's the way the company sold it, and that's what you got. Whereas if you go the route of building your own PC, depending on what you want to do with the games, you can spend however much or however little amount of money that you want.
Absolutely. You have more control. And there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to each, but me personally, I prefer the computer because I get to play everything I want. I know exactly when I need to play it, and I'm just used to it.
Same. And I've had a Steam account for pretty much half my life at this point, so I was quite literally raised on the PC when it comes to my gaming habits. Other than my childhood years, of course. Well, my early childhood years, but it's a familiar setup, and for me personally, I'm not trying to run games at the absolute max settings, which means my PC budget probably won't be as high as someone else who wants to crank everything up to ultra and have the absolute best surround sound possible. So there's a lot of wiggle room when it comes to your pricing.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of my favorite parts of using a computer for games is your overall floor is not bad. And if you've got the money and you've got the desire to have everything perfect, then you have that ability even after you buy a PC because you can just buy the parts and upgrade slowly over time.
And that really is the appeal. Just one final question before we end off
Hmm.
here. What are you playing recently? Like, what games have you been into lately?
So recently I am playing a game called Cult of the Lamb. It's just a fun game where I run around as a sheep and fight enemies while taking care of other sheep. And then I'm also playing a game called Black Myth Wukong, which is a game where you get to play as Wukong. And it's a lot of fun if you like games like Dark Souls.
Ah, yes. The Black Myth Wukong won Game of the Year, didn't it?
I think so. And as someone who's played it, I think it deserves it because it's actually a very well made game.
Well,
And oh,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask you, what games have you been playing recently?
Well, to build off your conversation there, I want to play Black Myth Wukong really badly, but um, as kind of a counterpoint to my own argument for PC gaming, my current computer has does not have the means to run that game. So I'll have to look into upgrading my hardware before I'm able to play it. But one game that I've been playing a lot lately is this game called Helldivers 2, which
Ah, yes,
which we've played together, and
we have.
I've been playing it for well over a year now. I've been playing it since release, and it's basically a game where you are a soldier in space and you drop down with a squad of these other soldiers, and it's a giant war simulator. So you fight against mutated bugs or Terminator like robots, and it is an extremely immersive future space war experience, is the best way I can describe it.
Yes, and it's very fun to play with friends, especially. Like, we've played together and we spend a lot of time playing with friends together. So it's one of those games that's even more fun with another person.
And that really kind of is the beauty of gaming as a whole, is no matter what you're into, there's really something for everyone.
Absolutely. There's games that are for playing with other people. There's a lot of solo games like Black Myth Wukong, and some are even just a combination of both. And it's my favorite part is just enjoying these aspects of each game because you're always in the mood for something different each time.
Right, like I'm a huge fan of the Dark Souls series, which is very similar to Black Myth Wukong, but those games are extremely challenging, and a casual gamer will typically end up quitting at the first boss fight because it demands more than the average game does. But that's the beauty of gaming as a whole, is there's plenty of other games like Minecraft where you can just take it slow and build anything you want, go at your own pace. The sky really is the limit, and that's probably one of the biggest reasons why I've continued playing games to this day, is because no matter what happens, you're never going to run out of them to play.
Exactly. I believe my Steam library by itself has a lot of games that I've barely touched. So even if I was to stop buying games right now, I have countless hours of games that I can play.
Yeah, at this point, our Steam libraries probably have so many games in them that by the time we are on our deathbeds, we probably will not have touched all of them. And that's just what we own.
Exactly. Yeah, nothing that's even being released in the future, just what we own.
Which
Speaking of which, before we finish off, do you know how many games you have in your Steam library?
I do. I have over I have over 150. I don't
150.
yeah, I I don't remember the exact number, but I know it's over 150.
You definitely have a lot. I've got about 100 more than you. I've got 261 that I've built up
200.
over the years.
Wow. Yeah, that is. Wait. Oh, no, I have way more. I just checked. I have. I actually have the 250 plus badge, so I have 260 games.
Oh, so we have about the same amount of games.
Yeah, which is. Well, actually, that makes sense. We probably created Steam accounts about the same time. So,
Most likely, yeah. So it
yeah.
makes sense that we would have about the same over the years.
Yeah, we are seasoned collectors. So, a whole lot of content still left to touch that we might not ever even
Absolutely.
get to.
And that's the fun of games. There's always something to play.
A never ending abyss. Well, before this video becomes a never ending abyss of gaming talk, let's go ahead and call it here. But this was a blast. Um, with that being said, this was Nick and Matt's Everyday English Corner, episode 7, video games. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yep. See you in the next video.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.